Imagine having your life perfectly planned, with everything under control, until a single unexpected event turns everything upside down. Emily, a woman who always believed success would be the natural consequence of her hard work, now finds herself facing a crisis so dire it could destroy everything she's achieved. But instead of succumbing to despair, she discovers an inner strength she never knew existed. What does she do when life presents her with her greatest challenge? The answer could change everything you think about overcoming obstacles. Stay tuned, because what comes next will surprise you. Emily's life seemed perfectly aligned. She woke up every day at 6:30 a.m. with a smile on her face, ready to face another challenging day at the office. Her friends and co-workers saw her as the person who had everything under control. She was the epitome of success: a prestigious job, a rising career, loyal friends, and a promising future. For Emily, the world was unfolding exactly as she had planned. She always believed that with dedication and effort, anything could be achieved. Each task, each goal achieved, was another step toward what she imagined to be her ultimate goal: a comfortable, secure, and fulfilling life. Emily was in no rush. She knew that patience was one of the greatest assets for those who wanted to achieve great things. She enjoyed the stability and predictability of her life. Routine comforted her because she knew exactly what to expect. Her work, her home, her relationships, everything was in harmony. Emily had always been a meticulous, calculating person. She prided herself on having complete control over her life. When something went wrong, she knew how to fix it. When a challenge arose, she quickly found a solution. Life seemed easy to Emily, as if the world had been kind to her, handing her everything she wanted on a silver platter. And this made her believe that somehow she was destined for success. She was already on track, without even needing to worry about the obstacles that would arise along the way. But what Emily didn't know is that life often has a peculiar way of changing the course of things. Sometimes twists and turns happen when we least expect them, shattering the illusion that we're always in control. And when this happens, we're forced to look within ourselves and face a reality we'd previously ignored. Her undisturbed routine, her security, her certainties, all of it was about to be tested in ways she never imagined. What Emily didn't realize was that the greatest challenge of her life wouldn't come from outside, but from something within herself. Things were beginning to fall into place differently, and Emily's life, which until then had seemed unbreakable, was about to be transformed. As Emily looked to the future, feeling confident she was on the right path, she never imagined something so grand, yet so overwhelming, was about to appear in her life. The kind of event that would shatter everything around her, challenge her deepest beliefs, and force her to reevaluate who she truly was. The real question wasn't, how would she overcome this? But rather, could she overcome herself? And it's at this point that you, reading this now, might start to ask yourself, what if you were in Emily's shoes? How would you react if your life, which seemed so stable and perfect, was turned upside down? If everything you believed to be right began to crumble, what would you do? Would you fight to rebuild? Or, like many, would you succumb to fear and insecurity? This is the starting point of our story, a journey that isn't just about external challenges, but about what happens when we're forced to confront our own limitations, our deepest fears, and the uncertainties that define us as human beings. It's not just about what happens around us, but about what happens within us when we're challenged. And it's precisely here that you begin to connect with the true essence of what's to come. Emily's true transformation, the turning point that would take her out of her perfect world, begins now. And best of all, this story isn't just hers. It's all of ours. We've all experienced something that shook our confidence, our stability, or even our vision of the future. And it's there, in those moments of shattering, that we find our true strength. But before we move on and see how Emily will tackle this challenge, I want you to do one important thing. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like if this story touched something deep inside you, I'm sure. Because this journey, which begins with Emily's perfect life, has something more for all of us. She's not just here to entertain us, but to teach us something fundamental about perseverance, about fighting our own fears, and above all, about the strength we all have within. Stay tuned for the next steps in this story, because the big twist is just around the corner. Don't miss the sequel. Sign up now and find out what's next. It was a Tuesday like any other, and Emily was in her office, immersed in the spreadsheets and reports that demanded her meticulous attention. The coffee was perfect, hot, almost an extension of her impeccable daily routine. She had already completed her most urgent tasks and was preparing for another meeting, something she already knew by heart. Her work, though challenging, was her refuge. Here, everything was under control. But that day, something changed. Emily's phone vibrated discreetly on her desk. Looking up, she saw her boss's name flashing on the screen. Something inside her sensed this wasn't just a routine message, but a summons to something more important. She hesitated for a moment, but quickly answered, trying to remain calm. "Emily, we need to talk. Now." The words rang out like thunder, shattering the peace she had built over the years. Her heart leaped, a chill running down her spine. What could be so urgent? She had fulfilled all her responsibilities and more. Always. Exceeding expectations. What could have gone wrong? Upon arriving at the conference room, Emily was greeted by her boss's stern gaze, something she rarely saw. The table was cluttered with documents, but it wasn't paperwork they were discussing. She sat down, trying to hide the nervousness that was beginning to tighten her chest. "Emily," he said in a voice far from friendly, "we had a big problem. An error in a critical report you sent to the client yesterday. They're furious. And now, we're in a crisis." What happened? She felt a crushing weight on her mind. The crisis wasn't just about numbers. It was about reputation, about trust, and most painfully, about the fact that she, the person who had always had everything under control, was failing. I reviewed everything before sending it, and I don't understand how this happened," Emily said, her voice wavering. She searched for answers, for something that would make her understand where things had gone off the rails. But his boss didn't seem willing to give easy answers. "It's not about what you understood, Emily. The fact is the client's trust is shaken. And in this kind of situation, there's no room for error. This isn't just a typo. It's a strategic error. And now we're on the verge of losing the contract. Believe me, this kind of thing isn't easily resolved." Each word felt like a blow. Emily tried to process what was happening. She felt like she was in a nightmare, unsure of how to wake up. What frightened her most, besides the crisis itself, was the feeling of helplessness. No matter how much she had dedicated herself, how much she had prepared, one mistake was putting everything she had built at risk. But the shock didn't end there. The pressure grew, her mind spinning as she tried to find a way out. A plausible explanation. Something to convince everyone that this could be fixed quickly. But as the minutes passed, she saw that the situation was beyond her control. Her boss, who had always praised her, now seemed distant, implacable. His gaze reflected the weight Emily was carrying. She wanted to justify herself, to explode with explanations and blame herself, but she didn't know where to begin. Words failed her. She left the meeting with heavy shoulders, her phone still vibrating with messages, none of which made sense at the moment. The world around her seemed to have slowed down. Everything she believed to be right was crumbling before her eyes. "This can't be happening," she whispered to herself as she walked back to her office. But it was real. The impact of the mistake was there, present, and there was no escaping it. Sitting at her desk, she stared at the computer screen, the same screen where, hours before, she had felt confident and capable. Now, it seemed like a reflection of a version of herself she barely recognized. It wasn't just the mistake at work. It was the feeling of having lost control of everything. Emily spent the next few minutes in a spiral of thoughts. How did this happen? Where did she go wrong? What should she do now? She knew she didn't have time to wallow in despair. She needed to do only one thing: fix the mistake. But how? How could she deal with the magnitude of something that seemed unsustainable? The weight of responsibility was crushing her confidence. She knew the work that had gotten her this far could be destroyed by a simple mistake. A mistake that, in her mind, should never have happened. And in that moment, Emily found herself at a crossroads. She could either wallow in guilt and regret, or she could lift her head and find a way to save everything. The doubt was immediate, but the need to act soon prevailed. What would she do next? The minutes felt like hours as Emily sat at her desk, staring at her computer. The room was silent, except for the intermittent sound of notifications and missed calls pulsing on her phone, as if the outside world was waiting for an answer. But deep down, Emily knew the real battle wasn't outside, but within herself. She knew she was facing a crucial decision. The mistake she'd made at work wasn't just a technical glitch. It was one that could jeopardize everything she'd achieved over the years. Her boss's words still echoed in her mind, like distant thunder that wouldn't go away. "We're on the verge of losing the contract." That statement sounded like a bluster, but for Emily, the gravity of what was at stake was far more than she could admit. The weight of responsibility was crushing her from every side. That afternoon, Emily felt like she was carrying a ton of weight on her shoulders. The pressure was unbearable. It was as if, with each passing second, the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. She could see the future crumbling before her, a cascade of consequences that could not be reversed. But what consumed her most was not just the fear of losing the contract, but the fear of failure, not just for the company, but for herself. Emily had always believed she was in control, that with discipline and effort, nothing could stand between her and success. But now, sitting there, she felt all her hard work being reduced to a single mistake that threatened to destroy her credibility and the path she had so painstakingly paved. She felt she could do no wrong. Not now, but the weight of responsibility was too much. She rose from her chair and walked to the window. She looked out at the city, with its constant hustle and bustle, and thought about how much her world had suddenly changed. The moment she made that mistake, everything seemed to unravel. The control she cherished slipped away, like sand through her fingers, and what was left now was a vast void. How could she explain it? How could she make amends for such a huge mistake? With each question, another feeling of helplessness crept over her. There was a knot in her stomach, a growing anxiety that seemed to expand. The internal pressure was more relentless than any external voice. She began to feel like an imposter, someone living a lie, pretending to have everything under control when in fact she didn't. Emily tried to remember times when she felt confident, when the future seemed clear and the path unhindered. But now, the future seemed hazy, an uncertain road ahead. She sat back down, taking a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts, but her options were unclear. On the one hand, she knew she needed to find a quick solution. The contract could be saved, but it would require more than a simple apology. It would require decisive action, a leadership stance. But on the other hand, Emily feared the team's reaction and, even more so, the impact it would have on her career. Would she have the courage to take responsibility for something that could have such serious consequences? Night began to fall, and the light streaming through the window gradually faded. The silence felt heavier, more oppressive. Emily was alone with her thoughts. She looked at her phone, hesitated, but couldn't bring herself to make the first call. What would she say? How would she begin the conversation with her boss? And what about the client, that all-important client? She knew nothing would be the same. Any more words could ruin her chance of recovery. And deep down, she feared this could mark the end of her career at the company. It was as if time were slowing down around her, with each second prolonging the pressure. transforming it into something almost physical, palpable. The weight of responsibility wasn't just emotional, but mental and even physical. Emily's head ached. Her eyes were tired from so much reflection, but she couldn't stop. Like a movie, images of her professional life flashed before her. The accolades, the recognition, the victories. Now, everything was threatened by a single mistake. She stood up again, paced the room, and took a deep breath. I had to make a decision. What tortured her most wasn't the mistake itself, but the pressure of having to be perfect, of having to find the solution immediately. What if she couldn't? What if this was the failure that would define her forever? The phone rang again, and this time she didn't hesitate. With a trembling hand, she answered. The words still stuck in her throat, but somehow she knew she had to speak. She couldn't run away anymore. The pressure of the moment seemed almost unbearable. The responsibility to salvage what was left of the situation seemed to rest in her hands. But would she have the strength to handle it? The boss's voice still echoed in Emily's mind like a distant echo, even after she hung up the phone. Each word seemed to brand her soul, the pressure tightening with each passing second, as if the weight of the world were falling on her shoulders. She stood there, motionless, staring into space. The reflection in the window made her wonder. Who was that woman staring back at her? What happened to the confident, unshakable Emily everyone knew? Automatically, she reached for the water bottle on her desk and, as she tried to drink, felt her hands trembling. The water ran down her chin without her even noticing. Nothing seemed real, as if she were living a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Each breath was labored, as if the air were thicker, heavier. Her eyes searched for some form of reassurance, some answer that would return her to that comfort zone she so cherished. But nothing was there. The calm she had felt until then, that absolute control over her life, was dissipating before her eyes. Emily sat back down in her chair, but this time it felt like the first time she was truly taking in her surroundings. The office walls seemed more closed in, more unforgiving. The sound of the machine's keyboard, the hum of the air conditioning, everything seemed like torment. What do I do now? She thought, repeating the question in her mind like a useless mantra. Doubt consumed her, leaving no room for an answer. The fear of failure was real, immense, paralyzing. The fear of being seen as incompetent, of being judged, of being responsible for the ruin of something as grand as that contract. But what was really eating away at her was the feeling that, deep down, she no longer knew who to trust, not even herself. Images began to form in Emily's mind, distorted and chaotic. She pictured her boss, his cold, disappointed gaze, and her co-workers murmuring about her failure. What she had always taken for granted now seemed to be slipping through her fingers. Her mind raced in circles, trying to find a solution, a way out, something that would make her feel like she was still in control of the situation. But as time passed, she realized she was sinking into a sea of uncertainty. Every attempt to think more clearly was drained by the avalanche of fears. She tried to focus. Breathe, Emily, she told herself, trying to calm herself. But how could she breathe when the feeling of drowning was constant? Every idea that surfaced seemed irrelevant, as if the solution she sought was always just a step away, but never within reach. What if she'd done everything wrong? What if the trust everyone placed in her was a fallacy, an illusion built on her own dedication, but now crumbling before her eyes? The despair of not knowing if she could repair the mistake consumed her, and no matter how hard she tried to rationalize, one thought kept surfacing, relentless. What if this failure was irreparable? Insecurity, like a poison, slowly spread. Emily no longer trusted her own decisions, her abilities. She saw herself as a fraud disguised as success. That feeling of inadequacy, which she had always managed to hide behind her achievements, was now there, naked, raw, with no escape. The fear of failure was almost physical. Emily could feel her body tense, her muscles tensing with each passing minute. She knew the decision she had to make would be crucial, but the pressure to get it right made her reasoning falter. Every choice felt like a double-edged sword. Any movement, any additional mistake, could spell doom. Like a leaf in the wind, she felt like she was being swept away by a current she couldn't control. "Am I capable?" she asked herself for the first time. A simple, yet devastating question. Doubt about her own competence took root deeply. As someone who had always had everything under control, how could she now realize she was losing it all? How could she ask for help when she had always been the person everyone turned to for solutions? Emily was alone with her thoughts, alone with her fears, and it seemed that with every passing second, the distance between her and the solution grew wider. Time continued to pass. The hours dragged by, and she barely noticed the minutes slipping away, consuming her. But what shook her most wasn't just the mistake itself. It was the loss of control, the loss of her own confidence, her very identity as a professional. She no longer knew who she was, no longer knew who to trust, and worst of all, she no longer knew what to do. Then, in a moment of despair, Emily found herself staring at the computer screen, trying to understand the words of the email she had started to write to her boss. But the words no longer made sense. They were merely a reflection of her inner turmoil. She didn't know what to say, and this made her feel even more helpless. The feeling of paralysis consumed her. She stood up again, feeling the need to get away from it, to breathe, to find some kind of answer. But the doubts, like shadows, were always there, waiting for her. With each step she took, the despair grew louder, more present. Emily was lost, and in that moment, she didn't know how to find her way back. Emily walked slowly down the empty office corridor, the echo of her footsteps mingling with the distant sound of muffled conversations. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the world were digging its roots into the ground, preventing her from moving forward. The overhead fluorescent light flickered, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm. But Emily was oblivious to her surroundings. Her mind was elsewhere, lost in a sea of thoughts. She sat in her chair, the same one where hours before she had felt so confident, so capable. Now it felt like a strange space, a silent prison where the ghosts of her own doubts watched her. She tried to look at the computer screen, but the words were blurry. What should she do now? How to move forward? It was impossible to ignore the feeling that her life was adrift, in a boat without a paddle, being carried by the waters of doubt and fear. "I never imagined I'd be here," she thought, her heart tightening. She'd always considered herself strong, self-assured. But now, faced with this mistake, this unfolding crisis, she found herself with her defenses falling one by one. Why was this so hard to deal with? The uncertainty was overwhelming. Every thought that arose seemed to involve more unanswered questions. Emily was no longer certain of anything, as if all the certainties she had built throughout her career and her life had disappeared, swept away by a relentless current. She didn't know if the next step would be the right one, and this made her question her own ability to make decisions. She closed her eyes for a moment, seeking silence amidst the chaos. But the silence only made her hear the inner turmoil louder. Her breathing became faster, more irregular. "I can fix this. I have to fix this," she forced herself to think. But there was a voice in her mind that kept repeating, "What if you can't?" It was hard to explain, but despair had a peculiar way of manifesting itself. It wasn't an obvious fear, something she could simply point to and name. It was an uncertainty that permeated every thought, a feeling that perhaps she was living in an illusion, that all the success she had built was nothing more than a house of cards about to collapse. Emily picked up her now cold coffee cup and turned it over in her hands, searching for something to focus on. But instead of finding the answer to the dilemma before her, her mind wandered to a deeper place, the place of inner doubt, the place where she wondered who she really was, what she really wanted. Had success always been her goal, or was she deep down just trying to fill a void? These thoughts began to take over her mind, like a whirlwind of disconcerting emotions. She had never stopped to reflect on this. Her life had always been a constant pursuit of results, of achievements. But now, everything seemed disconnected. What did she really want from all of this? To succeed at any cost? Or was there something more, something she had never allowed to surface? She got up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. The busy streets, the hustling cars, the people coming and going. It all seemed so distant, so out of her control. For someone who had always lived her life with a plan, she now felt powerless in the face of uncertainty. What she saw in the window's reflection wasn't the strong, confident person she used to be. It was a version of herself she barely recognized, lost, unsure of which path to take. Time seemed to pass differently. The hours felt heavy, dragging slowly, as if each minute were an eternity. And yet, the decision she needed to make, the choice that could change the course of everything, was there, hanging in the air. Emily felt paralyzed, as if frozen in the middle of a road, unsure whether to keep walking or turn back. She closed her eyes again, this time tighter, trying to push away the feeling of despair. But the questions, the doubts, continued to pound her mind like relentless waves. Am I really capable? Can I recover from this? Is it too late? These questions swirled like a whirlpool, a mental storm that seemed unstoppable. What Emily didn't realize was that she was living in a moment that, while devastating and confusing, was also a moment of profound transformation. The uncertainties she was facing, the internal crisis that now dominated her being, were not signs of weakness. They were signs that she was finally being forced to look within herself and rethink her choices, her priorities, her true strength. She realized something fundamental, a thought slowly emerging in her mind, like a faint light at the end of a dark tunnel. She didn't need to have all the answers right now. She didn't need to fix everything immediately. What she needed, above all, was time to understand herself, to understand what this situation meant for her life. She knew the first step was to accept the uncertainty, to embrace it, and that, in itself, was a step forward. Emily sighed deeply, feeling a slight relief. She didn't have all the answers, but maybe that was what she needed, to allow herself to live without having to control everything, to let things happen, without desperately trying to fix them. Maybe this was the beginning of her, recovery, understanding that uncertainty was part of the journey, and instead of fearing it, she could learn to use it to her advantage. The weeks following the crisis seemed to drag on, but at the same time, something inside Emily began to shift. The fear that had once paralyzed her now seemed less intense, less immediate. She still felt uncertain, but with each passing day, the stones that had knocked her down were becoming nothing more than distant memories. That nightmare, which had seemed endless, was no longer so present. Emily knew she was dealing with something bigger than simply recovering from a mistake. She was dealing with rebuilding her own confidence. It was a gray morning, the kind of day that would go unnoticed by many. But for Emily, it was the perfect morning for reflection. She was alone in her office once again, but something about her was different. The restlessness she felt, that whirlwind that seemed to take over her mind, had softened. She had begun to seek ways to deal with her insecurity more productively. Instead of wallowing in doubt, she began to seek answers, not in the world around her, but within herself. And it was in this moment of introspection that she realized something that would change the course of her journey. True strength came not from without, but from within. She looked at her desk, at the stacks of papers and reports. Before, she felt like she needed the approval of everyone around her to feel valid, to feel like she was doing the right thing. But over time, she began to realize that external validation wasn't what truly sustained her. It was her own resilience, her ability to keep trying, to keep going, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. That, indeed, was what made her who she was. Emily closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel a calm within herself, a sense that life wasn't just about achieving external goals, but about how she dealt with adversity, how she saw herself in the face of it. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to always be in control. The important thing was knowing she could get back up, that she had the ability to face whatever life threw at her. Slowly, she began to reevaluate the situation, not weighed down by guilt or frustration, but with an open mind, ready to learn. She had made a mistake. And yes, it had consequences. But that mistake didn't define who she was. It was simply part of the journey, an opportunity to learn, to grow, to become stronger. Emily's true strength lay not in her ability to avoid failure, but in her ability to rise again after each fall. That moment of stillness made her realize the depth of her own resilience. Emily had always believed that strength came from achievement and recognition. She had unconsciously sought it in every area of her life. But now she understood that true strength came from the courage to keep going when the world seemed to be falling apart. It was knowing that failure was not the end, but a stepping stone to something greater, something deeper. That day, Emily did something she hadn't done in a long time. She paused. She let go of her immediate concerns and allowed herself to simply be. She didn't need an immediate solution. She didn't need to control everything. She needed, above all, to learn to trust her own journey. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, saw her boss's name flashing. But this time, something in her had changed. Anxiety no longer gripped her. She felt prepared, more poised. Emily answered, now with the calm confidence of someone who knows she can face whatever comes her way, without needing external validation to prove her worth. Emily, we need to talk about the next phase of the project. But first, I need to say something. Her boss's voice sounded on the other end. She took a deep breath, feeling a growing calm within her. He was about to talk about the mistake, surely. But Emily knew that, regardless of what was said, she was ready to deal with it. She was ready to own up to her part, learn from the experience, and move forward. What if I hadn't reacted like that? She thought. But then remembered. Life's difficulties never come without reason. Life, she now understood, always brings opportunities for growth, even in the most difficult situations. With her eyes closed for a moment, Emily allowed herself to feel proud of herself. She had faced crisis, insecurities, and doubt. But now, she knew she had something within her that could not be taken away. Her inner strength. She could rise again. She could keep going, even when the path seemed blurry. Because in the end, the only thing that truly mattered was how strongly she looked to the future and refused to be defined by a single moment of failure. She was ready for the next stage of her life and knew that regardless of adversity, true strength would always come from within. And with that, she felt that the future, which had previously seemed bleak, was now illuminated by the confidence of someone who knows that the journey of overcoming adversity never ends. It only transforms with each new challenge. Night had fallen, but Emily was still in her office, lost in thought, in a stillness that seemed far removed from the outside world. The room was lit only by the soft glow of her desk lamp, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of a radical change. The weight of the decision she needed to make became clearer with each passing moment. The mistake she had made, the crisis that had made her question everything, was still on her mind. But now, something inside her was shifting. She knew she was at a fork in the road. The first road was the easy one, the one everyone would probably expect from her. She could follow the narrative life seemed to offer her. Apologize for the mistake, try to remedy the situation conventionally, and then hope everything would return to normal. Perhaps there would be a temporary reconciliation, a nervous smile from her boss, some relief from the client. But she knew deep down that this superficial solution wouldn't solve anything. It was the kind of decision that would allow her to continue hiding behind her flaws, that would fuel the fear and insecurity that still haunted her. But there was another road before her, and this road required something deeper, something more challenging. She knew. She could no longer live in fear, with the constant feeling of constantly trying to keep things under control. She needed to free herself from this constant pressure to be perfect, to always be the best. She needed to accept that the journey wasn't about not making mistakes, but about learning from them and moving forward. "I won't hide anymore," Emily thought, with a clarity that had previously seemed distant. She looked at her screen again, at the reports, the messages, and the meeting. Notice flashing in the corner. It wasn't just about work now. It was about her identity, about how she saw herself in the world. She knew the hardest path wasn't apologizing and bowing to the pressure of the outside world. The hard path was accepting the mistake, taking responsibility for it, and turning it into something positive. It was about finding the strength to get back up when things don't go as planned, to keep moving forward even with the fear of failure still lingering. It was about understanding that even in failure, there was room for growth. And most importantly, it was about not letting fear paralyze her. Emily felt the weight of the hours that had passed. She had done enough reflecting. The fear, which had always lurked, needed to be left behind. She needed to make the decision now, because she knew it would change her life. She could no longer be the person who hides behind excuses, who tries to please others at the cost of her own peace. She no longer wanted to be that Emily who felt she had to be perfect. The moment of decision had arrived. She knew that by making this decision, she would not only be changing the course of her career, but also the course of her life. The only way to overcome fear was to face uncertainty with courage, not with a mask of confidence, but with the truth of who she was and what she was capable of. She rose from her chair, her eyes steady, and her expression determined. It was time to act. The phone was within reach, and she knew what she had to do. Emily wouldn't wait any longer. She wouldn't let fear control her. It was time to be honest with herself, to be truthful in her actions, even if it meant facing harsh reality. She picked up the phone, took a deep breath, and with a trembling hand, dialed her boss's number. The sound of the line connecting seemed heavier than usual, but for Emily, that sound symbolized something new, something she needed to do to break free from her own shackles. When her boss's voice finally rang out on the other end, she felt the weight of the conversation lift, as if she had already prepared herself for everything that was to come. "Hello, Emily," he said, his voice serious as always. "Hello," she replied, her voice firm but with a hint of vulnerability she no longer feared. "I'd like to begin this conversation by apologizing for the mistake. I know the consequences were severe, and I have no excuse for what happened. But I'm ready to face this head-on. I want to find a solution, and I want to work to repair what was broken." The conversation continued, but Emily already knew what was happening. She was no longer dominated by fear or the need to be perfect. She was dealing with the situation with courage, with a willingness to face the truth head-on. She was choosing integrity, honesty, and the inner strength she had finally recognized within herself. And by the time the call ended, something new had arisen within Emily. She knew she had taken the first step toward a new version of herself. Not a version that did everything right, but a version that knew what to do when things fell apart. It was a decision she would never forget, because by taking that step, she had decided to continue her journey. And somehow, she knew that by doing so, she was transforming her life. The phone rang again. But this time, Emily didn't hesitate. Her breathing was even, her mind focused. The weight that had previously crushed her, like a dark cloud about to collapse, now seemed to have lifted. It wasn't because things were resolved or because the mistake had been erased. It was because she finally understood that the real challenge wasn't the crisis itself, but how she chose to respond to it. The boss's voice on the other end of the line no longer sounded so cold, so distant. It was different. The voice that had previously been pressing, with its stern tone, was now calmer, as if it too were breathing a sigh of relief. "Emily, we discussed the Options. The client understood that the error was a minor operational oversight and not a bad faith mistake. They decided not to cancel the contract, but they want to see changes. They want to know that we're learning from this and that in the future, we can avoid something similar. This means you have a second chance. The words she'd heard might have been simple, but for Emily, they were the release valve for a new beginning. The internal struggle, the sleepless nights, the weight of failure, all of it now seemed to have a purpose. She felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, followed by a profound relief, as if the burden had finally been lifted. She knew it wasn't the end of the road, but the beginning of a new journey. What she didn't know before, what she never imagined possible, was that the true value of her victory lay not in the opportunity she had gained, but in the strength she had discovered within herself, the resilience that had led her to face fear and uncertainty with courage now placed her in a place of power. She was no longer at the mercy of others' expectations or her own insecurities. She was in control of her journey. Emily looked out the window, feeling the cool morning breeze enter the room, and smiled unhurriedly. The true transformation wasn't in a client's approval, nor in her boss's words. The true change was in her soul, in the certainty that she could face any challenge, not because life would always be easy, but because she learned to be strong, not by avoiding mistakes, but by facing them head-on. She knew this would be just one chapter of many. The journey would never be perfect, but now she was ready for whatever came. The biggest challenge wasn't beating the client or correcting the mistake. It was overcoming herself, leaving behind the fear that limited her, and making the decision to be who she truly was. A woman who knew that, despite her stumbles and falls, she would always have the strength to get back up. "I can do it," she whispered to herself. "I'm stronger than I thought." And deep down, she knew this was true victory. Life, which had once seemed like a maze of expectations and pressures, now seemed like an open field of possibilities. Every mistake, every challenge, became simply an opportunity for growth. And most importantly, she knew she was ready to walk this path with renewed confidence and courage. If you also believe that the greatest victories come from the courage to face your own fears, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of overcoming like this. Because like Emily, we can all find our true strength, no matter how great the challenge. The secret is not to give up. The journey is just beginning.